Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is John Allen. I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and it's my sincere and great pleasure to welcome you all for an online conversation on China's growing technology and its technological reach and its prowess in the world today. This morning's webinar complements the recent publication of papers from the Brookings series, Global China, Assessing China's Growing Role in the World. Indeed, it could not come at a timelier moment as our nation and the rest of the global community battle the COVID-19 pandemic and as geopolitical landscapes are profoundly shaped as a result. Involving scholars from across the Brookings Institution, our Global China series is a two-year initiative that seeks to provide an empirical baseline for understanding the trajectory of China's influence in Asia and other regions around the world. And it's in partnership with the Ford Foundation, and we're very grateful for that support, and examines issues of foreign policy, the economy, and of course, technology. And on this issue, while the rise of China's technological edge has long been recognized, its significance is best underscored by today's ongoing global crisis. Employing surveillance technology to track and restrict and record citizens' movements, China implemented an extreme response to curb the COVID-19 pandemic within its own borders. The country is also testing the use of both autonomous and 5G supported delivery systems to transport medical supplies and minimize person-to-person contact. As well, it has utilized its own production capabilities to create medical equipment called PPE, or personal protective equipment, for its own population. Indeed, it has sent these same products around the world in a gesture as so-called mask diplomacy or COVID diplomacy, something no other country is doing at such a scale. Yet these actions also come at a cost. The use of surveillance technology alone raises serious questions of privacy. And furthermore, we must consider how China's intensifying technology competition will relate to the ever-increasing U.S. China tensions, also to the U.S. alliance management challenges and our complex and shifting global supply chains and debates over economic and technology decoupling, and certainly the regulation of large technology firms. So to that end, today's event will consist of two panels, the first of which will address issues surrounding China's ambitions and progress in building out what we might call global technological infrastructure. And the second will address how we should understand the trajectory of U.S. China technology competition. We'll have the privilege of hearing from colleagues from both inside and outside Brookings, and we're especially pleased to have experts from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University, led by Director Jason Matheny, to whom I will be turning the podium in just a moment. It's always good to see you, Jason, and thank you for joining us today.
You too, John, and thanks to you and Brookings for your leadership. Thanks also to Tarun Chabra, who in addition to his general responsibilities for this project, spearheaded CSET's participation from the start. Finally, thanks to the authors and to all of those who are joining today for your resilience during COVID and for not losing sight of the challenges that will confront us beyond this crisis and beyond this decade. No one needs an introduction to Brookings, but I'll say a little about CSET. We're a new research center at Georgetown University focused on studying the security impacts of emerging technologies, supporting academic work in security and technology studies, and delivering nonpartisan analysis to the policy community. We have an unusually large pipeline of translations of original sources, particularly from China, and a large data effort to analyze data sets relevant to science and technology, including scientific publications, patents, investments, and workforce data. Partnering on this project with Brookings was a natural, and I'm so pleased with the results, which have informed and challenged much of my thinking about China and technology. I'm looking forward to the discussions today, and to kick us off, I'm honored to introduce Chris Meseral of Brookings, who will moderate our first panel.
Thank you so much, Jason, for the great and kind introduction, and to General Allen as well. As mentioned, our first panel We'll take an in-depth look at the digital technology infrastructure that China has been developing. And to do that with this panel, we're fortunate to have with us today 5 esteemed scholars and colleagues on technology in China. We have Nicole Turner-Lee, a Brookings Fellow in Governance Studies, who wrote a great paper we recently released on 5G in China. We have Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, a professor at the University of Missouri and non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, who authored a terrific paper on Chinese exports of safe city and surveillance technology. We have Carrick Flynn, a research fellow from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University, who wrote what, in my view, has already become a vital paper on semiconductor manufacturing. We have Frank Rose, a senior fellow in foreign policy at Brookings, who published a great piece on China's efforts in the space race. And we also have, last but not least, Aaron Klein, a fellow in economic studies at Brookings, who has a fascinating paper on Chinese digital payments. We've got a lot of ground to cover and relatively little time, so I'm going to start out by asking each panelist to briefly introduce their particular technology domain and what China is doing in that space. And then we'll move to a discussion about the policy implications before opening the Q&A. So without further ado, Nicole, I'm going to kick it over to you. Nicole, 5G is a technology that just about everyone has now heard of, but almost no one actually understands. Can you walk through what 5G is and what China has been developing and how China has been developing and deploying it?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I want to thank General John Allen as well as Jason for kicking this great event off. And I'm very grateful to our colleagues at the China Center for involving me in this initiative. So it's interesting, Chris, I think you're completely right that people often hear the term 5G, but they don't quite know what it's referring to. So I'm going to give you, to the best of my ability in my few minutes, just a quick technological overview and then why this is important to this conversation. I think compared to 4G LTE, which is probably the G that most of us are actually using right now, the promise of 5G is pretty exciting because of the fact that it has peak download speeds as high as 20 gigabits per second and lower latency, which is particularly important at this time, not to bring in the COVID-19 pandemic, but this movement towards remote medicine is going to require the type of latency that does not disrupt the connection between individuals or between enterprise-based software that will be pretty important, particularly as we see more remote access in agriculture or more enablement of the Internet of Things. And so I share that because, as my friend Tom Wheeler would say, we talk about the 5G networks as hardware, but in this particular case, there's a software element to it, which I think also has some cybersecurity concerns, which is really at the root of my paper. We as a country here in the United States actually took on 4G LTE, and out of that came the digital sharing economy, the Facebooks of the world, the Google. When we look at the ride sharing economy of Uber and Lyft, for example, those were all enabled through the ability to have higher and faster bandwidth that enabled us to use our smartphone devices to really engage in these very rudimentary functions that have now become part of a way of life. And if we look at the period that we're in now, having access is even more important. So how does that relate to China? In this, what I call a race or competition to 5G, and I have gotten some feedback, well, maybe it's not a race, maybe it's more like a sprint, maybe it's more like a marathon, or heck, maybe it's a competition. The bottom line is whoever actually gets there first is going to demonstrate global leadership. And when I say global leadership in the paper, I'm really referring to the fact that China has actually done a couple things, Chris, and then I'll wrap up. They've been able to release the type of multi-band spectrum that will actually, equip these devices to do some really neat things. Whereas in the United States, we've been spectrum stuck. As Roger Etner would say, we have a spectrum imbalance, and that's sort of forcing us to throw out as much government-based spectrum and reallocate that to commercial purposes based on consumer demand. The second thing that we have a problem with is the global supply chain, and I'm very enlightened by General Allen's comments about PPE. The same challenges that we have of PPE is the same challenges we're going to have when we realize that we really have little competition within the United States and less cooperation with European countries when it comes to 5G equipment. And I would say lastly, as we look at why this is important, whoever gets there first has, I think, the biggest advantage, and that is standard setting. And so, Chris, I'm one of those people who's been watching this debate, and I'm one of those people that's always advocating for the people when it comes to availability of networks to be able to do really cool things. But the challenge I see with China, and I'll wrap up here, is whoever gets to this race to 5G at the end will essentially be the global leader when it comes to standards, security, device interoperability, and other functions that I think are at the heart of this network that we're actually, predicting known and unknown innovations, right, of the future. So I think it's just really important for us to actually put that in perspective. And I'm really happy to be amongst people where we can actually talk about this in ways that lend itself towards either some global cooperation or some understanding, right, of how important it is to drive the force of these new technologies that are essentially disrupting legacy models as well as creating new and emerging platforms for development.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the idea of this, not necessarily being a race, but maybe a marathon. How do you see that playing out going forward in the next, few years? I mean, there's one kind of 10 to 20 year cycle where it's more of a marathon, and then there's one in the next few years when 5G is rolled out. Is that something that the U.S. is involved in right now, or is it really kind of something that's being led by China at the moment?
It's so funny. I think, if I were to look at the U.S. and China on this, I would say that now the marathon of the U.S. in terms of, updating outdated policies or figuring out what types of spectrum bands could be available and made available quickly to market, right? I think we're actually getting this. If you actually look at the trade, every day new spectrum is being auctioned by the Federal Communications Commission. So I personally think as we look at this as a race or a marathon, the key thing is the United States cannot just catch up, right? We have to continue to exercise, I think, the global leadership that we've exercised when it comes to 4G LTE technologies. Europe pretty much defined the standard when it came to 3G. The United States stepped in and did 4G. And what's more imperative, Chris, to your question, is on the brink of this is AI. So this extent to which both countries are actually embracing AI technologies and have the platforms that are ready to support things like augmented and virtual reality, that will be at the crux of this. And that's why I think actually the United States is, may not be winning more so on the infrastructure side of it, but we definitely are engineering in terms of our research and development. These are American companies that are at the forefront of self-driving vehicles and AR and VR. So I think going forward, to your point, for me, the geopolitical battle is standard setting. When you get down to it, whoever actually defines what that network, how it's configured, what the safety and security measures around that is essentially, and I know in our work together, these national security concerns are real. And they also drive market competition on the back end, right? Because whoever gets there first will basically define the infrastructure configuration of that network. So I always say to people, not to stop here, particularly in my area of domestic policy, let's figure out how to do something that's calibrated. And I actually suggest that if you haven't read the report, I suggest like a really simple 3-point plan, because I don't think the United States wants a nationalized 5G network like China. I mean, we're not China, right? But what we do need is we need some coherency around what we're actually doing from a public policy front. And we need some more technical coordination so we don't have what Edna has called the spectrum imbalance. So we can at least be in the stage where we're still on the field versus sitting on the sidelines trying to figure out how to catch up.
No, it's a great point. I really appreciate the point about standards in particular, which I think we're going to come back to frequently throughout this discussion. Before we kind of turn to standards, which I think touches all of the different layers of infrastructure that we're talking about, I do want to continue with some of the level setting on what these technologies are. So I'm going to turn it over now to Aaron Klein to talk a little bit more about digital payments. Explain, Aaron, for us, it kind of just seems very seamless. You go and pay with your credit card, or, maybe even you have a smartphone and you pay with that. We don't really think much about it, but China's done some really innovative things in that space. And I'd be curious, for your thoughts on what China has been doing and why that matters.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to the center. Thank you to General Allen and everybody else. The world has changed. We invented this technology in the 1960s with these little magnetic stripes and these little plastic cards, and we go anywhere in the world and we think this thing is going to work. And in point of fact, when this thing actually, when you get down to it, right, this isn't Visa, this isn't Southwest, you have to go all the way to the back. And you find that there's a bank behind it. This one happens to be Chase. This bank we know of as American Express. These are bank-based systems that move money from one person, a buyer, to another person, a seller or a merchant, through a network of 2 to 3 to sometimes even more banks. And each bank takes a little bit of a fee. A lot of Americans misunderstand this business model. This business model is not about interest. This business model is primarily about what's something called swipe fee, which is the little bit of money, 2, 3, 4, 5% that merchants pay when you transact things. This system, invented in the United States, originally around restaurants, has become the global leader of payments. And when you control the payment network, you control a lot of other things. And this has also become core and integral to bank profit models. This is one of the main stools of banking. Well, enter China. In China, the merchants didn't want to pay these small fees, and the banks kind of didn't really aggressively, successfully figure out how to market this situation. And that led the line of fintech. And there are two main fintech providers in China, AliChat and WeChat and WePay. And let me briefly explain, they use something called a QR code. This is mine. Everybody gets one when you sign up. And there are two ways that you can use this at the register to pay for something. One, you can just pull it up and the other person will scan it. Or two, you take out your smartphone and you scan their QR code. So you only need one of those two things to work. And in point of fact, immediately when that happens, money comes out of your digital wallet and moves straight into their digital wallet. No bank, no intermediary, no fee. And this system took off like a hockey stick. There are over 1 billion monthly users on each platform alone. You can go almost anywhere in China and use one of these things. You can be on the top of the Great Wall of China, and there's a guy in a cart with a set of waters, and he has a little piece of paper, doesn't even have a phone himself, has a piece of paper, and you scan it and you move your money back and forth. Now, let me explain a couple different elements of this, because it's a little bit foreign to people, but it's very powerful. Alipay is kind of like Chinese Amazon. And when you put money in this wallet and you transact between businesses, there becomes a giant incentive to leave money on this platform because there's a very small fee charged sometimes to the user to download the money back to your bank account. So what happens? Well, you buy the rest of your stuff. Think if you're a restaurant, customers pay you on it, then you buy things from your suppliers on it. The more you use, the higher your ranking goes on your profile. Ask yourselves, if 10% of your salary was deposited directly into Amazon, would you spend it? What type of competitive features or values would that provide to people selling on this platform versus not? The second element, WeChat Pay. WeChat is kind of like Chinese Facebook combined with a set of messaging situations. And again, think about if Facebook knew every business that you bought from, and think about if every business on Facebook knew every other business that you bought from. The value of monetizing that data becomes incredibly important to that platform. And so what you've seen is these platforms rise, bringing in more merchants, being able to start to monetize these data and provide a legitimate threat to the American dominance and hegemony of these little plastic cards. In fact, if you go around the world now within the United States, particularly any place with Chinese tourists, Las Vegas, Disneyland, go down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, and you'll see little signs. We accept WeChat Pay, we accept Alipay. Even Walgreens allows that, for example. You know, this is going to start to become one of the dominant forms of global payments. And that has tremendous ramifications for the banking system and for US foreign and domestic policy.
Thanks, Aaron. That was a great kind of primer on what these technologies are. Can you speak, I'm going to come back to you a little bit more on some of the policy angles, but before we do so, like, can you just speak a little bit more about what's at stake for the US if we lose that kind of, right now, kind of American credit cards and American digital payments tend to be, or at least Western forms of digital payments tend to kind of be the dominant means of transacting around the world. And it sounds like from what you said, some of these Chinese digital payment systems are now spreading outside of China. What's at stake for the US and our allies with that?
Well, number one, this is a large business. I mean, these are hundreds of billions of dollars a year in payments and in data flow. Number two, there's this potential ability of all that data. Think about all that data that's getting put out, right? When people have to move into a different segment or a different platform, if it gets adopted by American consumers, which I think is unlikely, but if it gets adopted more globally in the third world, then all of that data and information goes to China. Lastly, the US has increasingly been using the payment system as a means of foreign policy. You anger America, we threaten to cut off your access. Remember, Mnuchin made a comment recently towards Iraq about an Air Force base. Well, maybe we'll cut you out of the US payment system. If you're a country, you have to be able to process these cards in order to have your economy work. and because these processing essentially go through U.S. systems, that gives us tremendous use. It gives us use in sanctions, money laundering, but also as a tool of foreign policy. We're not too far ago. I'm old enough to remember something called traveler's checks. I'm also old enough to remember when both parties thought Russia was an enemy. And in that process, at one point, we leaned on Visa as a way to counteract some of what Russia was doing by threatening to take them off of the payment system. Think about what type of disruption that would be. Now imagine if China's offering an alternative. There'd be zero disruption. All you have to do is sign up for an Alipay account. And then think about how that information is going to hook onto what their platform to do business. Is the future of business globally, in the third world and developing countries, in China's sphere of influence, is that going to be Alipay or Amazon? That payment system provides a tremendous incentive and network to tip those scales.
Thanks so much for providing that lay of the land, and also just a reminder of how old I've become with the travel. I remember travelers checks too. We'll circle back to kind of I think what you're getting at was kind of some of the weaponized interdependence, arguments about how financial systems are used, which I'm sure we'll circle back to in a bit. But I do want to continue on with some of the level setting. We've talked a lot about 5G and digital payments so far. I think most people are at least aware of what those are, but there's another piece of the digital kind of infrastructure that's being built out, or technological infrastructure that's being built out, that's a little bit more opaque to many of us, and that has to do with advanced semiconductor manufacturing and these things called photolithography machines, which I love to geek out about, but I don't really roll off the tip of the tongue very well. And so we're very fortunate to have Carrick Flynn joining us, who can kind of hopefully provide a bit of an overview of what those technologies are and how China's been developing them. Over to you, Carrick.
Thank you, Chris. So in the paper I wrote with my co-author, Saif Khan, for this series, we distinguish between sort of three layers of technology. The first is the computer chips themselves. The second is the factories where the chips are built, which are called fabs, it's short for fabrication. And then the third is the manufacturing equipment, which goes into the fabs, the factories, and actually makes the physical chips. So China's behind, but it's been catching up in designing chips. They are also behind, but also have been catching up in making the fabs that actually make the chips. But China basically doesn't make any of the manufacturing equipment that actually goes into the fabs and actually makes the chips. What's more important is that China probably can't make this equipment. So to understand why, we have to go back and think about the chips. State-of-the-art computer chips have billions of transistors, and these have feature sizes as small as 5 nanometers. For a sense of how small 5 nanometers is, your fingernail grows 5 nanometers in 5 seconds. So the machines that make something that precise and that complex are, as you'd imagine, themselves really precise and really complex. So in the question in particular, you mentioned photolithography equipment. Photolithography is a fantastic example of this. So photolithography equipment is just one piece of equipment in the manufacturing process. There are many dozens of pieces that are involved. It is so difficult to make photolithography equipment at a scale of 5 nanometers that there's only one company in the world that can do it. So this company, it's based in the Netherlands. The only thing it does is make photolithography equipment to make computer chips. That's it. That's its entire business model. It has a market cap of $100 billion. Now, there are other companies that make photolithography equipment to make computer chips, but they can't get to that small of feature sizes, so they're making older generations of computer chips. Now, these other companies have as much relevant expertise as you could possibly have. If they could break into the market for the state-of-the-art machines, they absolutely would. There's an enormous amount of money in it. The reason that they don't is because they can't, and the reason they can't, even with all their experience, is because it's almost impossibly difficult. Now, China has basically no existing industry or experience with this at all. So if you wanted to get into this, it would have to start from zero. Now, if China did manage to do this, if it did manage to climb this, $100 billion mountain, all it would have would be one piece of equipment. They would still have to start from scratch and climb, dozens of other mountains to have all the other pieces of equipment. So why does any of that matter? So in order to make many state-of-the-art weapon systems or surveillance systems, you need state-of-the-art computer chips. They go into everything. You need these chips to make supercomputers, which design atomic weapons or hypersonic missiles. These chips are obviously essential to 5G and to many of the technologies you need for techno-authoritarianism and to anything at all to do with artificial intelligence. Now, if China can't make its own state-of-the-art chips, it'll have to import its chips from us. And that means there's an opportunity to use targeted export controls to deprive the Chinese state and other potentially bad actors from using these chips and developing these technologies. And this could have quite an effect in terms of, for example, the AI arms race everyone talks about. Now, we already use a lot of targeted export controls on chips to China. This is like a known avenue. The problem is we can't have like one hand that's withholding chips, while the other hand is giving China the equipment to make their own. So it's an unusual choke point, but if we impose stricter export controls on the manufacturing equipment today, the equipment like photolithography equipment, we can maintain control of the chips tomorrow and into the foreseeable future.
That's a great overview, Clark. Thank you. And I love the analogy, the fingernail analogy. When I read that in the paper, I almost laughed out loud. Like that was a brilliant way of putting it.
I had to repeat it. It blew my mind when I found it.
It's such a great way of illustrating exactly how small these things are. One of the just immediate follow-up questions I would have is before we kind of hopefully can get back to the export control issue, because I know that that's also going to be relevant to even some of the potentially the policy responses to things like surveillance exports that Sheena Greitens is going to be talking about. But before we get to that, can you talk a little bit more about kind of China's Made in 2025 effort and what is it that's proving so difficult for them to be able to kind of manufacture in the way that Western companies can?
Yeah, so China's spending an enormous amount of money trying to get semiconductor independence. And the way it's mostly been doing this is by building fabs and then buying the equipment to fill it. Now, despite this, China has not caught up. It's done a good job closing the gap, though. Not with chip manufacturing equipment. Again, it's just importing that, but with actually building the fabs and making the chips, and to some extent also with chip design. So the way it's been able to do this, with especially the chip fabs, is by using subsidies equivalent to like 40% plus of a firm's revenues. Through billions of dollars worth of IP theft. And this isn't like a number grabbed out of the air. This is like there are lawsuits that have settled for billions of dollars over the IP theft, as well as poaching thousands and thousands of Taiwanese semiconductor experts at amazingly exorbitant salaries that make me wish I was a Taiwanese semiconductor expert. So by hook and crook, they've sort of learned how to build these fabs and chips, and they've done a tremendous job of catching up and closing that. But and what I would say is if the United States and allies continue exporting the manufacturing equipment, I think China could catch up potentially in the next 10 years. It's not guaranteed because this is an enormous industry, but it's quite possible. Now, if they did, it wouldn't exactly be the sort of leapfrogging that they talk about in China, at least in this industry. It'd more likely be something like a displacement. There's this interesting dynamic where a state-of-the-art fab costs costs as much as $20 billion to build. And what this means is that there's only really room because of the chip demand in the world for maybe about 3 fabs at the state of the art. And this will be 3 fabs anywhere in the world. So if China ends up as one of those 3 fabs, what it'll do is take one of the other 3 who are there under market pressures and basically bump them out of the market. Now, I don't know who would be the one to actually end up away from the state of the art. But it's very easy to imagine how China doing this could potentially mean that the United States itself would not have a state-of-the-art fab, and that we would have to start getting our chips from Taiwan or Korea or China, in which case, the strategic situation would be significantly worse than it is now.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we'll come back to that because I think the strategic situation is ultimately where we need to contextualize the discussion. But before we get to that, I do want to turn it over to Frank Rose now to talk a bit about another. Not so much necessarily maybe a discrete technology like 5G or digital payments, but to talk about the effect of technological infrastructure on the space race, and in particular, kind of its impact on some of the strategic competition between the U.S.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. It's great to be here. Over the past couple of decades, China has devoted significant resources into developing its space program. In 2 ways. The first has been civil space work, things like space exploration, space science, global navigation, like our GPS system. They have their own system called Beidou. However, they're also devoting significant resources into their military space program. Some of the things that they're doing, like reconnaissance and communication in the military sphere, are the same things that the United States does. However, there are some more concerning developments. And from my perspective, the development of China's anti-satellite program, in my view, is of great concern to the United States. Now, in 2007, China conducted a kinetic energy intercept and / destruction of one of their own satellites at about 850 kilometers in outer space, which created 3,000 pieces of debris larger than 10 centimeters, which will stay in orbit for perhaps hundreds of years, putting at risk the satellites of all nations. Now, the US and the Soviets developed similar systems in the Cold War, but they never really moved forward with large-scale deployment of these capabilities for a couple of reasons. One, the damage that ASAT weapons could do to the outer space environment. For example, in the early 1960s, we tested a nuclear weapon in outer space. Seemed like a good idea at the time, but we damaged and destroyed a number of our own satellites and other countries' satellites. And secondly, there was a strong link between nuclear deterrence and space systems. You didn't want to attack someone else's other satellite because they use that for nuclear command and control and early warning. So at the end of the Cold War, development of ASAT systems essentially stopped for a variety of reasons. The politics, Russia didn't have the money to pursue them, et cetera, et cetera. But that changed again in 2007, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, when China conducted an ASAT test against one of its own satellites. The question is, why did China do that, given the potential damage that ASAT weapons could do to the space environment? Very simple. The Chinese have been watching how the United States and its allies fight wars since the early 1990s. And what they have determined is that outer space is critical to how the US projects power globally. The United States uses space assets to detect, track, and target potential adversaries. Therefore, these ASAT weapons are designed to negate that US superiority or asymmetric advantage. And as long as the United States and its allies are dependent on space systems to project power, China is going to continue to invest large amounts of resources in these anti-satellite capabilities. Chris, you're muted. I can't hear you.
I have officially become that guy in a public broadcast who got to unmute himself. I apologize to you all and to our audience. I'm not gonna. I was hopefully going to be a little bit more articulate than this, but just can you kind of lay out a little bit more, like what's at stake if they start taking down our satellites, right? Like why is this such an important technology, not just to kind of the American military, but to kind of our society and economy?
Well, as I like to say, space is critical to just about everything we do here on Earth. It facilitates global navigation through things like the Global Positioning System, or GPS, enables global communications, allows the military to detect, track, and target adversaries, helps us verify arms control. If you can deny the United States and its allies access to outer space, you can achieve significant military advantage here on Earth. So what should the United States and its allies do? Well, we face a fundamental dilemma with regards to outer space in China. On one hand, China is developing this full spectrum of anti-satellite capabilities designed to degrade, potentially destroy our satellites. On the other hand, we have a number of key challenges to the space environment: orbital debris, the rise of mega satellite constellations, in a number of other challenges. So the challenge that the United States and its allies have going forward is, how do we develop a strategy that allows us to protect against China's anti-satellite capabilities, but at the same time provides entree so we can work together with China on issues of mutual concern like orbital debris?
Yeah, it's great. I want to come back in a minute or two to the issue of cooperation and kind of some of the bilateral ways we might be able to make some progress on that. But before we do so, I want to turn it over to Sheena Greitens, who's done some amazing work on surveillance technologies. Again, kind of not necessarily one particular discrete technology, but kind of how China has been using them and developing them for surveillance purposes and beginning to export them. And in particular, kind of looking at, her paper deals with the demand side of Chinese exports and looking at kind of some of the factors that might be involved with, why some countries are more likely than others to have these exports. So I'll turn it over to you, Sheena, to just kind of give a lay of the ground for or an overview of the space and what China's doing.
Thanks, Chris. I just want to say a brief thank you to Brookings and CSET for putting together this fantastic set of papers. I learned a ton from reading the papers that were part of this panel, as well as the second panel later this morning. They span a huge range of issues, but there are a lot of really interesting interaction points that I hadn't anticipated or necessarily expected. And so I think I just wanted to thank you guys for putting together the discussion and to you for moderating the panel, especially under the remote circumstances, which I think you get extra points for difficulty on that. So surveillance technology is really interesting. It feels like we barely go a day right now without there being some sort of story about one of the surveillance technologies that China is developing and now exporting. There's been a lot of attention mostly to the mechanisms of data collection. So facial recognition enabled sunglasses, or some of the video cameras, CCTV systems, the number of cameras that China is accessing. But when my research team and I started looking into the global spread of this technology, one of the things that struck us as politically most important was specifically how the technology was being used in policing and public security or public safety. And for that, the sort of one of the core features that was so powerful about what China was exporting or providing to the world actually didn't have to do with just the cameras and the hardware, but the capacity for data integration. And so the paper for Brookings actually focuses on these surveillance and public safety or policing platforms that not only collect, but also then integrate and analyze data. And so what I'm going to do, since Brookings did this fantastic graph and map is to just show you quickly what the growth of that trend over the last 10 years or so has looked like. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the growth in these platforms over time. And so when I say platforms, I'm not just talking about Hikvision selling cameras, even if those cameras are enabled with facial recognition. These are all countries that in some city or some state, the number of countries that have adopted this sort of platform that does not only the data collection, but the data integration, and then turns around and uses it for policing and public security, and sometimes outright political repression. And so you can see here an almost exponential growth over time. We're looking at, potentially around half the countries in the international system now have some place in the country that's adopted this technology, typically in one of the major cities. And here's the map of where those countries are distributed across the globe. And so you can see from 2008, the Beijing Olympics being a major demonstration point or kickoff of the start of this technology, to the end of last year, we cut off the data collection in December for this map. These are all the places where this technology is in use. So if you travel to one of these countries, you may well be captured or monitored by one of these systems. And so what's really interesting about this is that, you know, a lot of these stories and media reporting have focused on how this is changing life within China. But I think there are a lot of implications, and this is really now no longer a question about Chinese domestic technology and domestic surveillance, but what happens when you export that technology to a huge range of political systems around the world. And I'll add just briefly, you can see by looking here, this is not just other non-democracies, but a good number of democracies as well have at least experimented with or piloted these systems in a major city. So this is really something that has come from China, but is having implications for urban governance all over the world today.
It's great. Thank you, China. And just looking at your map, I think one of the things that's really just striking is, that point that you made about how this isn't really just about, a technology that China is developing domestically, but it's really, it's got a lot of global implications as it's being rolled out. And because it touches on surveillance, it's really kind of for those of us who care about democracy and human rights, like this is a really important issue. I'd be curious for more of your thoughts about what the U.S. and its allies should be thinking about in terms of how to respond to the spread of these technologies around the world, not just within China, but around the world.
Sure, it's a great question, and I'll add that I think that this is something we're going to be grappling with for a long time. As I was finalizing the paper, I was watching the unfolding debate about COVID-19 and surveillance, and the use of some of these tools being ramped up in places like South Korea and Taiwan, which have had a relative amount of success in managing their COVID-19 outbreaks. So I'll also say that I think we're just beginning to think through the implications, but I would group the implications that we might care about in this conversation into three main sort of baskets or categories. One is these issues of data privacy and data security. There's an ongoing debate. The U.S. government says that Huawei, for example, which is the major provider of these safe city type platforms, that data has a special, unique technical backdoor where it's accessible to Chinese law enforcement. And so data security and data privacy, I think, are real issues. We've seen places like Malta and the Philippines, when there is pushback on how the data is owned, protected, and managed, say, no, the data is all being kept domestically. It's subject to our laws, our privacy regulations. But we actually don't know in the vast majority of cases what the technical or the legal infrastructure governing data privacy and data security really looks like. And that's going to be an emerging discussion, again, that I think is going to be going for a long time. The second issue has to do with, the factor that you mentioned, wanting to contextualize this discussion, which is, what if this technology becomes widely used for urban governance globally, then how does that change the role of technology in U.S. China strategic competition? In some cases, Chinese development assistance is being used to help finance some of these projects. And one of the things that we find is that countries that have a sort of formal partnership with China, according to the very nice ranked list the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gives us, that is actually a pretty good predictor of the adoption of this technology. So there's a correlation between the spread of the technology and China's global strategic priorities, which suggests to me that this particular type of technology is linked to global strategic competition or Chinese global strategy. Kind of however you want to frame that. I'm happy to come back to that later, but I'm mindful that we have limited time, and I want to just briefly mention the third issue, which is the one that you began your question with, about the potential for this technology to contribute to democratic backsliding in human rights. I'm actually doing a project now to look at what happens to human rights and the quality of democracy when this technology is introduced. And we don't have a very good sense of the answer right now. There's a lot of concern. This technology isn't very well regulated. There was a great piece by Mira Rapp-Hooper and Sam Sachs in Foreign Affairs recently talking about how the political frameworks for regulating technology have lagged behind the experimentation with technology itself. And I think that's particularly true right now with the COVID-19 discussions and policy experimentation that we're seeing as everybody tries to get a handle on how to deal with the virus. But right now we see that this technology is going to both democracies and autocracies, and we don't really have a good sense in either kind of system whether this is going to negatively impact human rights and democratic backsliding. But we've seen cases in which the technology has been used to surveil political opponents. On the other hand, the countries that adopt this technology frequently talk about how helpful it is or how helpful they believe it will be in terms of improving public safety, attracting investment, boosting economic growth, because crime is such a drag on investment and economic productivity. And so there are some potentially cross-cutting effects on public safety, democracy, and human rights. And so I think it's really important going forward that US policy tries to get a handle on some of these questions so that we can have the right conversations, both in international forums and with individual countries, about why this technology is appealing and what the alternatives might be that are more compatible with democracy and civil liberties and human rights.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that kind of last thread. And I think one of the things, you touched on in your paper and have touched on elsewhere has to do with kind of standards bodies and the role of some of these technologies. I know we talked about that earlier, and I'm going to get back to Nicole in a minute on that. But is the US, are there standards bodies involved with some of these technologies like facial recognition? And if so, is the US kind of invested in those conversations, or is China more invested in them? Is that an area where we can potentially kind of push back on the use of surveillance technology for non-democratic purposes? What's your take or sense on that?
Yeah, so I was really interested to hear Dr. Turner-Lee's comment about the importance of standard setting, because this is an area where I see China exercising a fair amount of what was quiet and is increasingly being scrutinized global leadership. So China has domestic bodies that look at what their standards are going to be, and then they have been fairly coordinated and fairly assertive, I would say, about trying to promote those standards in international forums like the UN's ITU. And so one of the things that the paper notes is that right now, the ITU has gotten almost all of its proposals for global standards for safe city type technology and the use of facial recognition technology from Chinese tech companies. So we do have Chinese tech companies writing the global rules. About half of the standards that they've proposed have been adopted by the UN as the global standard. So that's really important. And one of the things that I think we need to be talking about, and the paper calls for, is for the United States to have a comprehensive strategy about standard setting. And I think that's particularly important in an area like surveillance technology, but I'm biased, it's what I work on. But this is really important for how we think about the use of police power, the use of the state's monopoly on violence, right? These things that really affect citizens' lives in both democracies and autocracies. And so I think it's really important that the United States have a comprehensive strategy, unless we want Chinese tech companies writing the global rules for how facial recognition is used in policing. The United States needs to figure out what it wants the alternatives to look like, and then to work with like-minded countries, because there are plenty of them, to promulgate a set of standards that we believe are fully compatible with civil liberties and human rights. And I think that's pretty urgently needed right now.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you might not be too biased in thinking that maybe the U.S. and its allies probably don't want the Xi regime writing the rules of the road globally for facial recognition tech. And thank you for that kind of great comprehensive answer. Dr. Turner-Lee, I want to turn it over to you in the kind of 5G space. Dr. Greitens just kind of laid out again kind of some of the, she mentioned the ITU and some other standard setting bodies. How do standards come into the conversation around 5G?
That's so interesting listening to she has a great presentation. Sorry, guys. Right. It's like the two ladies here. I was really intrigued by that map, because what actually happens in that map, it sort of demonstrates where we actually might be headed on the 5G space in terms of these dual ecosystems, right? And in 5G, we have this other political concern, which is around the use of Huawei equipment, right? Which is actually making it more difficult to navigate through, I think, what was suggested in that previous presentation, the national security concerns around the network. Where are the vulnerable points? And we're seeing our allies not necessarily coming on board with the complete ban that we've actually put in the US, but we also risk in the US through this alienation, exactly what Sheena's talking about, where Asian companies or Chinese telecoms are making their own standards while we're going through this process. And we're sort of fighting, another part of the battle with regards to the exclusion from our networks. And so I think going forward, that is like the biggest question that we have right now, Chris. I mean, when the Trump administration sort of moved to ban, full out ban ZTE and Huawei, what we actually saw was no actual response to this. And as a result, US companies who have a lot of embedded equipment from Chinese telecoms, within their existing networks, it became more difficult for us to navigate. And in a case like I suggested with 5G, where you're on a time clock, you're not only talking about the spectrum, but you're talking about the propagation of small wireless cells, right? Antenna to make the propagation work right in terms of densification. You're also talking about the applications and the R&D. You're talking about the safety and security concerns. And so again, going back to the prior conversation, and if we don't get wraps on what that looks like, we'll essentially see a 5G network that is primarily Europe and the US on one hand, and maybe Africa and China on the other hand, in terms of the way we've actually split that marketplace. And so, we're working on, I think there are mobile standards that are pretty much internationally recognized, but places like the ITU and the fact that China is also developing its own set of standard bodies when it comes to their technology. One thing on that, Chris, we're behind. And I can't say it enough to US legislators when we think about this. We're doing really great stuff in the now, but China has been experimenting on mid-band spectrum before we even thought about it. And so I think just having that ability to be ahead of the game is also going to influence their ability to drive not just the standards, but the diffusion of the technology within networks. And that should be disconcerting to companies where they will be told by the US that they cannot do business there, even though there are other European companies that we can. Just recently, Nokia and Ericsson came before Congress to sort of bid their case. But how do you manage that while standards are being developed? And that is the biggest question, I think, for 5G infrastructure today, that the conversations of US domestic policy were relevant, but now this global race is even more important as we go forward.
I couldn't agree more with that. Frank, I think you had a point that you wanted to jump in on.
Yeah, thanks very much. Listening to all the other panelists, the one theme that kind of brings all of these papers together is that the U.S. China competition is essentially about who will control the global information technology infrastructure and standards. And this point brings to mind the, quote, heartland theory put forward by British geographer and strategist Halford Mackinder in the early 20th century. Mackinder argued in his theory, whoever controlled Eurasia or the heartland would control the world. I think an argument can be made that in the 21st century, whoever controls the information infrastructure will dominate the world.
Wow, it's a pretty bold claim. I mean, so it sounds like you're saying the great game has shifted from Central Asia to the tech sector writ large.
I think there is an argument. Now, it's not an exact transfer, but if you look at what Nicole has talked about in 5G, what I have talked about in space, this data is critical to military operations, it's critical to sanctions, it's critical to the economy. If you can put yourself in a way to control the commanding heights, that will make you the dominant global power. Something to think about. Maybe there's a paper in there.
I think there's probably more than one paper in there. And I want to kind of kick it back to you to get, it's interesting that you would frame it that way right now. And also, I think one of the things that was really interesting about your paper was the emphasis on bilateral cooperation, which I wanted to come back to as well. And, we've talked about standards bodies, which tend to be a little bit more multilateral. One of the interesting things about your paper was the focus on bilateral cooperation. Is there a way of kind of, if this great game is kind of before us, is there a way of cooperating a little bit to kind of mitigate its more, it's the graver risks associated with it, so to speak?
Chris, I think the answer is yes, with caveats. First, we need to understand that the Chinese civil space program is a wholly owned subsidiary of the People's Liberation Army. So if you are to cooperate with them on civil space, there's a chance some of that technology could go back to the military. However, this is not the first time the United States has faced a peer competitor and tried to find ways to cooperate with them in outer space. In the early 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union had the Apollo-Soyuz mission. So the bottom line is, yeah, there are practical things we could do, but I would say we would need to do three things to make that happen. First, the United States would need to develop a comprehensive strategy for dealing with China in outer space, which links the civil with the national security concerns. Secondly, we would need to get relief from Congress, which currently has some pretty severe restrictions on our ability to cooperate with China in the civil space area. And third, we'd have to identify some useful, practical projects. One idea that Charlie Bolden, the former head of NASA, put out there was inviting China to join the International Space Station. But the bottom line is, I think there are some practical things that we can find to work with China on in civil space, but we're going to have to make that part of a comprehensive strategy.
I love the point about the comprehensive strategy, and I want to kind of, because one other, we need to have a comprehensive strategy that encompasses kind of bilateral efforts and also multilateral efforts on, things like facial recognition technology or 5G, but there's also kind of a strategy. I want to come back to you, Carrick, on some of the hardware side of this. How would, in your view, how would export controls kind of fit into, because I think that's kind of, you're right, that's one of the key pieces of leverage we might have, when it comes to something like pushing back on China's use of these technologies for human rights abuses, things like that. How do, in your view, export controls kind of fit into any kind of comprehensive strategy for that? And, is it feasible, in your view, that we might be able to see, the U.S., Japan, Netherlands, et cetera, start to implement these? I think Netherlands has done some export controls already. Like, I'd love to get your feel for, where that's going in the future.
Am I unmuted? Yes. To start with the last part of your question first, the Netherlands recently revoked a license to export the photolithography equipment I was discussing earlier, which I think was a huge step. And there's a Wassenaar Agreement, which is a multilateral export control arrangement. And on that, there are pieces of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The problem is that you can always just grant an exemption, and exemptions tend to be granted quite frequently. The sort of line in the sand you see on the Wassenaar Agreement is that you shouldn't be able to make feature sizes 45 nanometers or below. Now China's down as far as 14 nanometers and below because countries, including the U.S., just keeps giving them the equipment. Just exemption. So there's an ability to tighten that. Now. The semiconductor manufacturing equipment industry, because of all the costs involved, is much like the state-of-the-art fab thing. It's extremely concentrated. So you really actually basically just need the cooperation of Japan, the US, and the Netherlands, and that's sufficient to do it. Once you have this, once you guaranteed sort of Chinese dependence, then there's an opportunity to do export controls in a targeted way on the chips. And here you can do all sorts of things. And what's good about this is that it creates option value. You could also just not, like if for some reason we're like, it's fine, let them just purchase whatever. But on the other hand, if there's some company that's selling some particularly problematic piece of surveillance equipment that uses deep neural networks for facial recognition, for example, we might just be able to withhold the chips, and it's not clear they could make that indigenously. I think as an overall orientation, I like the approach of cooperation, of cooperating where you can. And I think there are a lot of areas technically where we could do potentially quite good cooperation on things like AI. Another colleague of mine at CSET's done some great work on opportunities to cooperate on technical AI safety research and standard setting. But you want the option value such that, especially for the particularly dangerous technologies, it can just be something where democracies as a group say, no.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of it'll be interesting and exciting. I think to kind of see that conversation play out, to see whether we do come together and say no. Like in particular, like we've gotten some questions even for this event about kind of how China's using these technologies in Xinjiang and elsewhere, and really in the view of myself and I think a number of other colleagues now, ways that are really repressing human rights at a scale that we haven't really seen before. And so I'm hopeful or optimistic, cautiously optimistic, I guess, that we might be able to, as a set of democracies that care about human rights, find some ways of pushing back on that. And I think the export controls that you mentioned might be at least one way of potentially doing that. I'm going to turn it over to Q&A in a minute, but before I do, I want to come back to Aaron Klein, and we've had this conversation now about standards and bilateral cooperation and export controls. How aggressive should the U.S. and its allies be in the kind of digital payment space and trying to push back on the growth of, Alibaba and other platforms as they're moving into that space internationally? Like if we tried to put in place kind of more aggressive efforts to contain that, would it work, or would it potentially kind of even accelerate China's efforts in that space?
Well, look, it's not entirely clear to me when people talk about digital payments, what exactly they're referring to, right? I mean, most money is digitized. You see these billions and trillions of dollars moving around in this COVID space, and it's not as if there's some giant printing press running paper. But what COVID has shown is that America's payment system is woefully behind the rest of the world. I mean, Frank has been talking about the space race, right? We won the space race in the 1960s. We put a man on the moon and back. We did that faster using 1960s technology than we got a single person their COVID money today in 2020. Think about that. In 50 years, we can't move money from Uncle Sam to millions of people in a pandemic faster than we could with giant transistors sending a person in a rocket ship to space. Now, in China, they don't have these problems. In China, they have a flow of payments that can move much, much faster. And in the US, you can't stop the modernization of payments. There's a moving of money that has to occur in any economy. And more advanced countries are going to move towards more advanced payment systems. I think what we need to do in the United States is sit back and realize that there's a cost of our inaction. Our system works really well for the rich. Everybody's getting 3% points and cash back on their Amex. And if you weren't one of the 20 million Americans who lost your job, you can wait a little bit for your COVID stimulus to check in. But one of our Brookings colleagues put out that 40% of mothers in her survey were too broke to get food for their children. Meanwhile, they're waiting for this COVID stimulus check that is waiting somewhere. If we don't modernize our payment system in the United States, we're going to fall behind China. We've already fallen behind. I'll leave with this point. England created a real-time payment system in 2008. Mexico in 2004. Brazil in 2005. Switzerland in 1998. Japan in 1972. The Federal Reserve is currently forecasting a real-time payment system in the US sometime between 2023 and 2024. We can't afford to just sit back and wait while the rest of the world leapfrogs us 2, 3, 4 generations of technology.
That's a fantastic point. Nicole, I want you to come in if you want.
Yeah, just real quick, and I'm listening to this conversation, and I really want the people who are watching and listening to sort of have one thing resonate with them. You know, this is a very hard conversation to have, to compare apples to apples, right? We live in a society which is much different than China. We have different democratic values and leadership, scope of leadership that dictates why some of these things take longer in the U.S. I mean, if I were to say that, you know, the U.S. was competing in 5G, I kind of would be wrong, because we have to go city by city and state by state to ensure that the placement of the equipment needed to propagate these systems, propagate these signals, is actually something that we're doing in a way that respects local authority. And so I think going forward, and I'm thinking what Aaron said, you know, in terms of some of my interests over the years in incumbent, why we don't have mobile payment systems here in the United States, particularly for communities that are mostly subjected to the digital divide and to poverty. A lot of it has to come to do with respect for our incumbencies, right? And what we've actually built in terms of the checks and balances, both from a regulatory perspective and a legislative perspective. So I think going forward, I think the question that we all should be asking, are we in a race to China, or are we in a race to a value chain versus a supply chain that makes sense for us and other allies that have the interest of placing human interests first and human values first, and, you know, not necessarily profit second, but a diffusion of a technology that, you know, in many respects becomes transformational. And that's what I think we saw with 4G LTE to a certain extent. We didn't see a technology that was just, you know, set aside for certain types of users, but we saw a technology that was diffused, you know, not just in the US, but across the world. So I wanted to bring that up, Chris, because I know, like, in the space that I talk about, it's very hard for us in the US to say, hey, let's be like China. And I think Frank's point on and Sheena's point on data is important. We don't have the same type of privacy implications and data privacy, lack of concerns. We're not a surveillance country. And so we cannot sit there and say, you know, we're all at the same starting line and we're going to do the same thing in China, because we're not. It's not going to fly in our country. So what we have to figure out is, how do we bring value to these conversations, and how do we bring value in ways that help us solve problems, both from the economic perspective, but also the problems that we just don't know about yet, right? And where do you leverage the technology to actually create that? And so I just wanted to put that out there, because I always feel like, you know, we can go back and forth, and you and I have been to China with others, and it's one of those things, like, it's just real interesting, right? As these technologies evolve. And what COVID-19 showed us in the US is that with a stroke of a pen, we can at least engage in national pilots. And if some of those things work better, you know, there might be the risk of removing some of those regulatory strongholds to do something different.
Yeah, thanks for bringing all that up. And I really love the framing of thinking about this in terms of value chains and not just supply chains. It really resonated. Dr. Greitens, did you have a point you wanted to come in on?
Yeah, just really, really quickly, I wanted to follow up on this idea of needing to be mindful of what local communities are looking for, and respect for local autonomy. I realize this isn't quite the same way that Dr. Turner-Lee meant it in the United States, but one of the things that was quite striking to me as I looked at adoption of Chinese safe city technology around the world was that there was genuine local demand for this technology in places. So I mentioned before that, you know, one of the biggest predictors of adoption of this technology was whether or not you had a strategic partnership with China. But another significant predictor was the level of violent crime that a country experienced. And many of the places that were adopting this technology, when they explained or justified that decision, and these are often subnational officials, they're often mayors, they're often state officials, so it's not always that different than the United States. The subnational politics and subnational variation becomes really important to communities and to leaders. And so I think the point there is that, ironically, and I say this with a lot of hesitation as someone who studies China, but it's not all about China. And I want the United States to be attentive to balancing its sort of concerns about China and the risks of the sort of technology that's being, quote unquote, pushed out of China, with an awareness of these local conditions. And I think that a one-size-fits-all message, yes, we want our messages to be coherent, but a one-size-fits-all message isn't actually what we're seeing Huawei doing in its marketing. It's quite regionally specific. and runs the risk of sort of sounding like we're not paying attention to the genuine concerns of our partners in countries where they feel like they need a solution. This is the best option that they see. It may be being subsidized. Yeah, it's not perfect, but they're going to give it a try. We may not think that's the right decision, or we may have concerns about the implications of the adoption of that technology. But I think those conversations are going to be a lot more productive if we have a real awareness and our messaging reflects that we understand what the local demand drivers are for this technology. It's not just a China story, it's a story about what's happening in, almost 100 other countries around the world and maybe more. And that's just not a one size fits all story. So ironically, maybe a less coherent message might be more effective and more accurate for what we're seeing in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're also just making a case for nuance, right? I mean, we need to, it's easy to fall into the kind of black and white U.S. versus China, one size fits all kind of argument. And yet, you're right. I think the point is very well taken that we need to have some nuance, especially as we roll it out to different localities around the world. I do want to, I could talk with you all day, just ask, pick your brains with my own questions. But I want to turn it over to some of our audience. We have one question from Simran at the University of Oxford, who is basically asking, what role education should potentially play in any kind of response. If technology is kind of the fulcrum of a lot of geopolitical conflict or competition, what role, in addition to kind of standards and other policy, policy activities we can undertake, what role education should play in that. Do any of you have strong thoughts about the role of education going forward in this space?
I can talk a little bit about that if you want.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I think that it's really important, and I think we could have a conversation, but I'll defer to the co-panelists who focus on the domestic governance part of this to talk about American policy. I think it's important to recognize that tech talent and the role of education is very much a work in progress in China as well. It is something that Xi Jinping, and I know some of the papers have focused on this, that Xi Jinping has talked about as being, a primary resource for China's technological goals and technological development. But what's really interesting in studying the adoption of surveillance technology is that even if you go around and talk to people in China, they identify human capital and the ability to actually operate and use this technology to its full potential as one of the sort of limiting factors right now. And so I think that's why China has the focus on developing human capital and tech talent that it does. But let's also not sort of overstate the omniscience or the sort of super ability to use this technology in China. It's still very much, I think, a work in progress. And that story isn't written yet. And again, then that leads to the question of, what the US and other countries are doing to foster education and tech talent development.
Chris, I could jump in. I think on the domestic side, just to sort of piggyback on what Sheena said, I think we've not done the greatest job in preparing tech talent in this country. If we look indigenously at the populations that are here, we have a challenge. We have disparities that come when it comes to where you live, what kinds of school you go to, all the way up to the food chain of who actually makes the decisions at some of our leading tech companies. And that's problematic if this is something that we want to embrace as a more inclusive ecosystem. And one that we know in all of the papers and all of the conversations that we've had today has a potential for not just, technological innovation, but economic development and jobs. And so we have a disparity when it comes to the preparedness of people in the United States to take on not just, and I would thinking about Carrick's paper, not just, the high engineering jobs, but we have problems with people taking on the, rudimentary, can I install fiber job in this country? And that's a problem, right? When we're trying to actually compete on a large scale and actually bring our talent and capability and thinking to other places. So I totally agree with Sheena. On our side, on the domestic policy side, we've had investment in tech education really changed by administrations. And so it's very partisan, I think, when it comes to that, as opposed to looking at it as something that is necessary and fundamental to any child or adult's education in the society.
Yeah, I love that point about education and the value of education. I want to pivot to another question that we got, which is, we've gotten a bunch of questions actually about education, but we've also got a lot about COVID, understandably, and the impact of COVID on, as we've been talking about surveillance technology. Obviously, that's a part of any kind of, policy for tracking and tracing potential patients. And we got one question in particular about thermoscanning. And the use of kind of temperature checks, as individuals are going into stores and office places, et cetera, which Shayla, the person who asked the question, was concerned about the privacy implications of that. Do you have, either for that issue specifically or just kind of more broadly at a higher level, do you have concerns about the way that COVID is resetting kind of the global conversation around surveillance technologies writ large? Dr. Greitens?
Yeah, sure. I think so the short answer, do I have concerns about how COVID is resetting the conversation, is yes. But I think it's going to be a more complex conversation than we might expect, in part because some of the places that used technology quite aggressively to tackle the COVID were not just, China, which has this massive surveillance project already, but places like South Korea and Taiwan. And South Korea has said specifically, okay, we're doing some things. These are going to be temporary measures. Here's the end. Here's when we're going to stop doing this. Here's when the data will be erased. So there's a clearer conversation about both the expansion of the scope of surveillance and what the limits or the rollback process will be. But that's really unusual. And every society or country is going to have to decide what its own set point is on how far it wants to go on surveillance, and then what kind of limits or rollback process it wants to put in place. So I hesitate to say that South Korea should be a model, because I don't want to suggest that means that these specific features or decisions or policies should be copied. But what I think is quite interesting is that there's been a more self-conscious conversation about what's the expansion, what are the limits, and then at what point will we roll it back? In the absence of that kind of direct conversation up front, we tend to see that crisis leads to the expansion of surveillance, and then it's tough to walk it back, because nobody wants to be responsible then for, well, what if it happens again? Right? Then I, as a policymaker, feel like I'm responsible for the loss of American life, or human life, if we're talking about countries beyond the United States. And so I think that, the potential is, if we don't have these conversations now, that the use of this technology is going to expand faster than policy can keep up. And we also won't have a clear sense or a clear vision articulated for the limits and the process of rollback. So I think that that's a really important conversation to have, but we're just at the beginning, and I hope we talk more about it soon.
Right. Chris, just a shameless plug. We put out a paper on this Brookings website. So myself and other scholars across Brookings are actually talking about public health surveillance, and particularly where that is problematic in the U.S. Just had to put it out there.
We'll go to the Brookings website. I'm sure it'll be front and center, and I encourage everyone to read that paper. We're all for shameless plugs here. Speaking of that, I know, Aaron, you had a finger up, so I want to turn it over to you as well.
I wanted to piggyback on something Shayna said in this conversation about surveillance. If you think about the payment system, it is one of the most effective tools for surveillance and one of the least effective tools that we have. We, in the 1960s, to try and catch the mafia and tax cheats, set up an anti-money laundering system. And we set this number at $10,000, which is if you use cash for more than $10,000, right? Cash is the ultimate anonymous source of financial transactions, that there had to be a report, a piece of paper filed. And as an economist, we appreciate what happens when you set an unindexed number. So we set this threshold in the 1960s, and it was really meant to capture big dollar transactions. You could have walked in, bought a fully loaded Cadillac in cash, not triggered this thing. In fact, you could have bought two, but we didn't index it. And what happens? 50 years later of non-index, you can't buy a single car in cash and not get that transaction, right? And in point of fact, we've let this anti-money laundering regime continue to expand in different ways, right? So we bootstrapped it to catch narco trafficking in the 80s, then pivoted to Al-Qaeda after 9/11 and terrorist financing. And now we collect so many of these transactions, these suspicious activity report filings, and it comes at a cost. And the cost is often borne by those who can least afford it. So when this PPP, this small business lending thing came out, and banks were tasked with giving essentially grants to all these small businesses, they were required to do all this anti-money laundering stuff on who they provided funds for. And so the first thing they did was, well, no new customers. We can only serve our existing customers. A lot of that was driven by this hidden anti-money laundering thing that the Treasury Department has left going on autopilot, collecting more and more information. It has real consequences. There were businesses in America that did not get PPP funding to deal with this COVID crisis because of an anti-money laundering regime situation. Now, does anybody think that we were trying to use COVID to recheck small businesses across America to see who was funneling money where they shouldn't? No. But these surveillance systems put in place get left on autopilot, and they have drastic ramifications when we least expect it, and often when we can least afford it.
You know, I think it's probably a great place for us to wrap up in just terms of, thinking about this as a marathon rather than a sprint. Like what we put in place now, especially in light of COVID, is really going to be with us for potentially decades to come. And I think it kind of underscores the importance of the conversation we just had around, digital infrastructure, its use in surveillance, and its impact on some of the geopolitical issues that we discussed. Before we kind of wrap for break, and I think we got about 10 minutes before the next panel, I just want to say thank you to all of my fellow panelists here. It was a really enlightening discussion. You always know it was a great panel when you learned way more than you knew when you started. So thank you very much. And we'll go on break right now, and then we'll be back in a few minutes.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.